Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Improving growth should ideally bring with it rising employment opportunities, but that has not been the case. What happens in an environment of slowing growth? How can the government step up? How can this situation be rectified? Debating job creation, recipe for economic growth will be our final panel of the conclave. Allow me to invite on stage Dr. Indira Rajaraman, former professor IIM Bangalore and member of the 13th Finance Commission, Dr. Jahangir Aziz, head of emerging market economics at JP Morgan, Mr. Niranjan, Rajadhyaksha, executive editor Mint, and Mr. Surendra Srivastava, chief financial officer MUDRA. Dr. Soumya Kanti Ghosh, chief economist at SBI, will be moderating the panel. And I invite him to accompany all our guests on stage. A brief introduction about our panelists. Dr. Indira Rajaraman holds a PhD in economics from Cornell University. She was professor of economics IIM Bangalore and was subsequently RBI chair professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Dr. Rajaraman has also been a member of the Reserve Bank's Technical Advisory Committee. Dr. Jahangir Aziz has headed the India Economics Division at JP Morgan before he moved to his current role in the global EM economic team. He's also served as the principal economic advisor to the Minister of Finance. Mr. Aziz was also instrumental in the setting up of the Product Development and Management Association in India. Mr. Niranjan Rajadhyaksha writes the popular Cafe Economics column, which has won several national and international awards. His book, The Rise of India, was published globally in 2006. And Mr. Surendra Srivastava has over 30 years of experience in banking, including about 19 years in microfinance, financial inclusion, and livelihoods. He has played a key role in bidding, design, and implementation of poorest states' inclusive growth program.
Welcome, and it's always a difficult task to preside over the last panel in every sense, but it is also an interesting one because you need to also take up the challenge of keeping people interested throughout the discussion. Before I begin, I would like to thank my panelists for taking out time for coming today. Professor Rajaraman coming out all from Bangalore, Niranjan, and specifically Dr. Aziz, who came for this program, and Mr. Srivastava. I think the topic for today is a little bit relevant. When you are actually sitting down and trying to figure out what could be a topic for an economist panel, because an economics is supposed to speak on everything. So we thought that possibly the correct or one of the more suitable topics for this panel could be that what about job creation? Because we have been hearing a lot about job creation, but unfortunately the issue is not discussed in India. There is a lot of debate on that regarding the data, regarding the employment creation in several sectors, regarding the numbers, regarding the informal, formal sector debate. So what we'll try to do, we'll try to cover all of this in this time and try to see whether we could decipher any opinion out of the panel discussion. To start with, I think two things. The first thing, I would like to give out some statistics which could set the context of this discussion. I think one of the commonly used terms in employment situation, which is most economists look into, is the concept of the employment elasticity. Basically, the sensitivity of employment to an increase in output. In fact, there has been several empirical studies in the Indian context which shows that there has been a continuous decline in this elasticity beginning 70s to 80s to 90s. There are plan documents of the government that shows that the employment elasticity in India in the last decade in 2000 had declined from 0.44 to as low as 0.01. That means absolutely there was no job creation possibly during 2004-5 to 2009-10. This is despite the fact that the India's average GDP growth rate was more than 7% in the last decade. There has also been studies by the Central Bank of India which shows a declining employment elasticity. So basically the studies and the numbers, if you look into it specifically, it shows that there is indeed a declining employment elasticity. There could be various interpretation to this number in terms of whether this is a formal sector or informal sector. But let me straight away go to our panel, and let me put this question to Dr. Aziz. I mean, if I look into this data, Jahangir, do you believe that there has been an oft-repeated claim that the growth in India is possibly not creating enough jobs? Or if I am very blunt, if I call it, say maybe a jobless growth. And the issue is that if employment growth has been so low in the last half decade or so, I mean, what could possibly the situation of the GDP growth rate, as you see the numbers in the last 1.5 years are actually showing a declining trend. So it could even deteriorate further. And do we need any lessons which we can learn from other economies in terms of whether these numbers actually makes any sense in the context of the overall employment growth?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. Let me address that question in 2-3 different ways. So let's get out of India for the time being and get out of the sense that, India is a unique and exceptional place. If you look at globally, starting with the developed markets, US, Europe, one of the biggest puzzles over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly about the US economy, has been the fact that every month, non-farm payrolls, which is the number of non-farm workers, have kept on rising. Unemployment rate has started to dip, yet growth hasn't picked up. I.e., if you take growth and divide it by the amount of employment growth, you get a sense of how productive this economy is. And the biggest concern in the US economy is that productivity has kept on falling. You see that globally across almost every country. We can't do that in India for the reason that you said. We do not have any data on employment. So it's very difficult to come up with any sort of answer to your question in the absence of actual data. However, let's look at the problem the other way around. If indeed we've had a decade or 15 years of jobless or near jobless growth, my guess is that it would have spilled into the street and we would have seen blood on the streets. The fact that we haven't seen blood on the streets, from that I would conclude that we might have questions about how many jobs have been created. We might have questions about whether these are good quality jobs, bad quality jobs. But my guess is that jobs have been created. Because in the absence of job creation, we have all gone through phases in the 70s, in the 80s, where job growth hadn't really picked up, especially in the urban areas, and we've seen the repercussions of that politically and socially. So I'm not in that camp who says, well, just because the data isn't there, that therefore there hasn't been any job creation. The concern is whether or not the amount of job creation is adequate. We are adding about 10 to 12 million new workers into the labor force every year. That's the quote-unquote demographic dividend, which I'm sure in this conclave, in every other conclave, everybody talks about proudly, about the potential of India based on that demographic dividend. The question is that adequate? And that's a separate issue altogether. But on your question, I would say yes. I mean, job has been created. Concern is it adequate?
So your point is that whether adequate jobs have been created or not. Anyway, Dr. Rajaraman, I would like to ask you, because you have been in the policy making for a long time. You have also been a member of the RBI Technical Advisory Committee. You have also been a member of the Finance Commission. So do you think that there is a case for any policy directional change on the part of, say, even the central bank or the government or the like, so that this if this perceived fall in employment elasticity or a perceived declining in the employment situation in India could be corrected?
You know, when we look at the inadequate employment creation, that was what was referred to by the previous speaker, I think you can begin to make sense of it only if you look at it sectorally. And in terms of a ranking of sectors by importance from the point of view of employment creation, to me, there's no doubt about the fact that it's the agriculture sector that we have to worry about, because it provides more than half of the labor force with employment and livelihoods. So we have to focus on that. Now, the previous speaker was referring to blood on the streets. We haven't had blood on the streets. As a matter of fact, we have had blood on the streets in recent years in the agriculture sector. Maybe not a lot of blood, but some blood. There have been violent protests, and there have been police firings, and people have died. And there have been very, very large numbers of suicides. So what does this farm unrest really tell us about the agriculture sector and about policy towards the agriculture sector? What it tells us is that policy towards the agriculture sector in India has been incredibly perverse. If you needed a textbook example of perverse policy, I think you would write about policy towards agriculture in India. Why? You had this farm unrest on the back of a bountiful harvest. So in a year when the harvest was good, you had a downward income shock. And in a year like last year when there was a bad drought, again you had a downward income shock. So you have a downward income shock when the rains are scarce, and you have a downward shock when the rains are bountiful. What does that tell you? Something is terribly wrong. Now, this is not the place, particularly for lack of time, for me to go into any details. But I think if I were to spell out the two things that we need to do in order to correct this perversity in policy towards agriculture, clearly the first would be risk mitigation. We are proceeding some distance towards that with the crop insurance that we have started, but in my opinion, it has been designed badly. I won't go into details of that, but certainly crop insurance is one way to go. That is for bad agricultural years. For good agricultural years, what you need to do is price smoothing. I mean, the answer is crystal clear. And unless you do risk mitigation and price smoothing at the same time, you're not going to correct the perversity in policy that faces the agriculture sector. And let me just add very quickly, here again, in terms of price smoothing, I think the government is proceeding in the right direction, but far too slowly. We need to really jack up food processing. We have a dynamic Ministry of Food Processing at the center, and they have an ambitious plan of establishing food parks all over the country. It's absolutely the way to go. This will only succeed with public-private partnerships, and there will be the usual problems of land acquisition and so on. But because this concerns the agriculture sector, I'm hoping that they can work out cooperative models of land acquisition that will solve the problem. I'll stop here, but I'll be happy to go into details in case you want me to. Okay.
No, I think there's a very important point in terms of the food processing which you mentioned. I mean, just the data shows that, for example, the farmers get 3 to 4 rupees. I was in West Bengal, I think 2 and 3 months back, when the West Bengal government was buying potatoes from the farmers at 4 rupees 60 paisa. And we get it at around 20-25 rupees per kg. And if you want to buy a potato chips for a kg, that costs around 280 rupees in Mumbai. So that's the irony of the food processing. Anyway, Dr. Niranjan, I'll just come to you. I think this is one of the points which Jahangir also mentioned in terms of there has been no blood on the streets, but possibly whether there has been not adequate job creation. And he also talked about a demographic dividend. I think there are estimates in the public domain by multiple agencies like World Bank, which says that India could potentially contribute more than 200 million new workers over the next 2 decades. And so basically that should account for a large increase in the net global supply of labor force over the next decade or so. So do you think that, the demographic dividend, this is purely a result of demographic dividend because the median age in India is around 25 years. Do you believe that it's an asset, or possibly it could quickly turn into a liability if something is not done on this employment front, and given the way jobs, it is adding to the job market?
Yeah, thanks, Soumya. First, I'd just like to deal with the broader issue before coming to your question. When the Planning Commission and all the other estimates of employment elasticity, see, a lot of those assumptions are based on the 2009 NSSO sample survey, which is the 66th round, which I think most people know had severe problems, including the movement of women out of the labor force. So I think a lot of those estimates are slightly to be taken with a pinch of salt. Just like Jahangir said, that one, sort of just intuitive sense is that if you had low employment growth or no employment growth, you would have blood on the streets. I would say that if you have 10 years of jobless growth, it would at some point reflect in wages, you see. And it doesn't make sense that why wages would be going up if there was absolutely no job growth. The issue, again, is that the quality of jobs is more important. We haven't been able to produce the type of jobs which are required in the development process. About the demographic dividend, yes, there's no doubt that India is in that sweet spot. The recent UN Population Department estimates show that India's working class age group will working class will peak in 2050. So we do have a long way to go of young people coming into the labor force. Now, I know a lot of people say that this is our demographic dividend and it's almost our right, that we are going to. But I think we should be very careful, that we can't assume that everybody is going to be absorbed, especially in high-quality jobs. And I think that is the key thing. It's not just job creation. If you look at the Asian development experience, which we used to famously learn in the Lewis model, that people move from farm to factory or from the traditional sector to the modern sector. That process is not happening. So there are a lot of people stuck in, somewhere in between. And I think that is the risk. It's not about unemployment in the Western sense, but just people trapped in low productivity, low income jobs.
See, I agree with you to some extent in terms of the adequacy of the job. For example, when we advertise, for example, even for the State Bank PO posts, there is lakhs and lakhs of applications. And recently I saw a post in UP. There was actually some advertisement for a low-grade post, and there was a lakhs of applications. So there is indeed, the adequacy of the, jobs which is on the radar. Coming to Mr. Srivastava, I just like to ask you take it to a different level and ask you in the context of this overall employment situation. I think recently the Prime Minister did say that it's not true that people think it's big industries and corporate houses that provide higher employment. However, the truth is that only 12.5 million people are employed by big corporate houses against 120 million by the MSME sector. We need to understand the energy of the bottom of the pyramid of individuals and provide them with means for upliftment. Basically, there has been a lot of discussion on the MSME sector. Yesterday, there was a discussion. Today, there has also been several discussions on the MSME sector. Do you think that the MSMEs can play a useful role, given the current constraints they operate in terms of the regulatory environment, with providing employment outside agriculture and industry?
Yeah, if you see, there's no doubt that SME is the engine of growth for developing economies like China or Japan. And there are certain challenges in creating jobs under MSME actually. If you see in the country, the 70% population is in rural areas. And if you think of rural entrepreneurs or rural MSE units, they have a lot of challenges. The jobs can be created by two ways. One is through the wage employment, and other is through the enterprise promotion or enterprise creation. Now, if you see both the points, they have their own limitations and challenges. If you think of enterprise promotion or self-employment, the rural entrepreneur does not know what to do. Where from he gets the information, how to make the project report, how to approach the bank, what are the schemes of the banks, how to market its products. So he needs virtually hand-holding from stage 1 to marketing. And for this, we have a dearth of agencies hand-holding them in the country. And there's a need for a number of BDS providers in the country who can handhold them. Now, of late, Government of India has done two major programs like Stand Up India and MUDRA, which focuses on MSME in a big way in the rural areas particularly. In Stand Up India program, the focus is that each bank branch should give at least one loan to SC/ST and one to woman entrepreneur. So the spread is national level, not that the banks can give more in the urban areas or in particular states and not in the rural areas or in the underserved states of the country. So this program is expected to generate more jobs and more units in the entire country, across the country. Secondly, if you see the skill development part of it, they don't know what they don't know the technical expertise, technical know-how of the activity they want to go for, and there's a dearth of agencies for the training. The country has the central government has identified this skill development program in a big way, but the adequacy of the capacity utilization of the existing training institutions, the issues related to standardization and quality of the trainers available in the country, and agencies who can certify these trainees. These are the issues which are there. If we can address these issues, then definitely MSMEs can be engines of growth for employment also. But as you said yourself, creating jobs is not that easy. You said elasticity has gone down. Even during the period of 2005 to 10 also, only 2.7 million jobs were created. So on an average, only 5 lakh jobs have been created so far.
Thank you. I think I'll come back to this elasticity issue at a later time. Now that we have a discussion on whether there has been adequate job creation, I think the house view is that the job creation has not been adequate. If I can just have the first question, let's take it from the audience. What do you think about India's employment growth? So if I can just have the first question up and. Okay, so the house is also divided almost equally in terms of whether it's a jobless growth or not. Anyway, that's interesting. Let me now shift the gear a little bit and take you through some of the issues which are pertinent to India's employment growth. See, one of the issues which I think Jahangir mentioned in the first, when I was mentioning about the first question, is that there are employment surveys in India and there is no employment data. I think the Planning Commission has recently constituted a task force, but as I understand, the job is to look into the employment survey. There was a one quarterly employment survey between July 14 and December 2016, which said that these sectors, the 8 major sectors of manufacturing, I'm not going to all of them, trade, construction, education, etc., created 6.4 lakh jobs. In comparison, these sectors are added around 13 lakh jobs between July 11 and December 13. So I would like to ask you 2 questions from here. The first issue is that, how do you interpret this sharp declining employment? As you have correctly said, in terms of the data, in terms of the survey, do you think that these surveys do capture the headlines, but the samples they cover are inadequate, small, and it's very difficult to get the aggregate national trends out of them, and they may not be accurate? So how does India overcome these data measurement limitations, which apparently could be a part of this low employment figure? It could be a part. The second part, a related question, I think, because we have been looking at the global economy in details, is that I think if you look into the history of India's employment growth, and there are enough statistics which shows that the manufacturing employment has in fact grown rapidly between 2000 and 2004-05 in sectors which were export intensive. For example, there were 9.6 million new jobs were created in sectors like garments, textiles, leather, and diamond cutting. However, the global recession after that, there was a decline of around 4 million jobs in the same sectors. So my second related question is possibly, do you think that the global slowdown or the global meltdown anyway did affect the job creation in these sectors or in the manufacturing sector overall?
So these are difficult questions. So let me first, before I go into the question, let me just make a comment on what Dr. Rajaraman said. I did not mean to be callous to say that there hasn't been blood on the streets. I just meant that it hasn't been as much as what this data would say. Your first question on, whether these servers are going to be adequate, et cetera, all of that boils down to a much bigger question. And the question is, we don't even have a statistics law in this country. Our state-level CSOs and our central-level CSOs are completely inadequately funded. In the absence of collecting the kind of data that a market economy needs to have, we haven't moved very much. Our data collection system still remains that of a planned economy where we run after quantities rather than prices and employment and things like that. So whether it's employment, and I don't even want to go into growth. I know you want me to answer that question, but I don't even want to go into growth. But it doesn't really matter what we're looking at. It is exceedingly inadequate, and it is almost, it's like, and I have an enormous sympathy for the policymakers, especially the RBI, who are essentially making policy completely blind. They haven't the faintest idea what's even happening. Is India's cycle going up or going down? We can't even answer that question. So, I know I'm not answering your question in terms of what is the labor the labor service, etc. We need to seriously revamp every aspect of a statistics data collection. It is not just a matter that we have labor statistics as a problem. But just to give you the global context of all of this, so if you look at, for example, in countries where data is available, in terms of adequate quality of data, and I'm talking about emerging market countries, not developed market countries. If you look at data in Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, these are the only 3 Asian countries that actually have reasonably good employment data. You'll find that even though employment rates in all these countries since the global financial crisis hasn't changed, in fact has improved, the actual number of hours worked has continued to decline since the global financial crisis. So even in those countries, the jobs that are being created and that are being counted as employment are mostly contractual workers, outsourced workers. And therefore, when we talk about, what is happening to productivity and all of these things which require in the denominator the actual number of hours worked, there is no way in which even to guess what is happening in India's context, because we don't forget about having hours worked. We don't even have employment data. So again, I know I'm not answering your question, but we really need to seriously look at data collection almost on an emergency basis at this point in time. Moving to the point that you're talking about in terms of, and again, connected to what Dr. Rajaraman and what Niranjan said, I am always extremely skeptical of the government or of economists deciding where employment growth should take place. I'm extremely skeptical of their abilities to even know what is the growth sector. And if you look at history, beyond very small examples that we are always thrown out, Korea, Japan in the 1950s and 60s, Korea in the 70s, industrial policies have never worked. So what we really need in terms of, you talked about export sector, and I'll talk about the export sector. Shomira is sitting over there. I'm sure he's going to have a different view since he was in the last session. What we really need to do is to be agnostic about where job creation happens. That's not the government's job. That's not the policymaker's job. That's the corporate sector's job. Saying that I only like manufacturing jobs and not service sector jobs is a choice that we have made so far. We want manufacturing jobs where shiny factories and people are going to go in and work there. But we don't like jobs created, for example, by a saloon or a barber shop. That's essentially when we talk about or we give precedence to make in India, that's exactly what we're doing. We need to be agnostic because we can't decide, because policymakers have a history of spectacular failure in trying to decide where jobs are created. We are not very good at that. What we are good at doing is to level the playing field. As a government, I should be completely agnostic where the job comes from. A job is a job. Let's not start picking, I want this sector job versus that sector job. Now, having said that, I completely agree with you on the point that the largest job creation that took place in India in India's golden 5 years was essentially the export sector. And that was the period of time when we, along with the rest of the emerging market world, had, for the lack of a better term, and I'm not trying to, I'm not using the term in a derogatory manner, essentially emerging markets had easy growth. You really didn't have to do very much. There was a whole bunches of people in the developed market who were perfectly happy to buy what we were producing. We made some small changes in our external sector, liberalized a little bit here, a little bit there, financially repressed both the depositors by having very low real interest rates and undervalued exchange rates, and we basically exported ourselves to that 8, 9, 10% growth rate. Since 2012, the last people in the last session obviously had a different view. Since 2012, 10, 11, globalization, global trade has fallen every year. In the last 2 years, real trade has been negative, growth has been negative. And that's the result of that. The employment growth hasn't happened because that's where the employment growth used to take place. And I think that, for the government, and going back to Dr. Rajaraman's point about where the policy should be, and that is where my problem is, that the policies, I don't know what next 5 years is going to look like. I don't have any idea what the next what the sectors are going to be. Therefore, I need to become agnostic about it. I need to level the playing field. I need to provide the incentives, and whether it's financial, whether it is policy-wise, that allows anyone to produce jobs and produce growth. And I don't think we are doing that. We are still playing God. And we need to stop playing God and let the ones who actually create jobs, the SMEs, etc., to actually start producing jobs. So I'm going to finish, I know it's a long answer, I'm going to finish with one last thing. So if you look at the work that Ijaz Ghani and others have done in the World Bank over the last 10 years, they have asked the question, who creates jobs in India? And I know that it includes the NSS data, this thing, the 66th round. But if you look at who creates jobs, you want to answer that question, jobs are created along the Golden Quadrilateral by export units of less than 10 people, by new units, and shockingly, or not so shockingly, headed by women. A woman-headed, less than 10-person SME related to the export sector is the largest creator of jobs in India from 2000 to 2008, for which the data is available. Look at the last 3 or even the previous government's budget. Where has been the incentive for any of these people?
Just before I go to the other panelists, let me just ask one point, Jahangir, that given that the export growth outlook doesn't look that promising, so do you mean to say that the job creation could also suffer in the next couple of years if that holds ahead?
Absolutely, because if you I can, yeah. No, absolutely. So if you look at the 2004-5 story to 2008-9 story, the overall story, right? What gave India the 8, 9, 10% growth rate? It was investment by corporate India. So corporate India went in investment went up from, I'm talking about corporate investment, went from 5, 6% of GDP to about 17% of GDP. So that created a lot of capacity. Who absorbed that capacity? And I know that a lot of people, even in this conclave and in every other seminar that I've gone to, talk about the great Indian domestic demand and middle class. Those were not the people who consumed the capacity or bought the capacity that was created by the massive increase in investment. It happened to be exporters. Exports went from around 12% of GDP to 26% of GDP, even if I take out oil refining. So most of the things that people bought, the things that investment created, was bought by foreigners. In this entire period, consumption actually fell as a share of GDP from in the mid-60s to about 50, 55%. So yes, I mean, until unless miraculously global trade once again goes back up, which it hasn't for the last 7, 8 years, we really need to refocus our policies towards domestic demand and domestic industries in order to once again restart the job creation process. And again, I don't see that happening at this point in time.
Okay, thanks a lot. Dr. Rajaraman, I'd like to ask you a related question. I think you said this in your first, when you were talking about an agricultural sector. And I think Jahangir also mentioned in some part. I think if you look into the economic survey of last year, it actually points to a shift in the job structure in India, more from permanent jobs to casual and contractual jobs. However, this increasingly temporary nature of jobs could have an adverse nature on the level of wages, stability of employment, and of course the social security. We as a country are very poor on social security. So why there is so much preference for contractual employment as of now? Is this the case that the employers prefer this form of regular form for employment to circumvent labor laws? Or are the labor laws needs to be reformed? Or is there any dearth of specific talent or skill in the formal sector?
Before I get to this question, I just want to respond a little bit to what Jahangir said about his agnosticism, which I presume, by that I presume you mean that you want to let job creation be shaped by the market, right? Okay, as an economist, obviously I agree with you. However, I don't think that I'm necessarily aspiring to divine status by saying that there are some obvious directions in which jobs can be created, and very importantly, near where people of working age currently reside, which is in the rural areas. So that is why I think food processing does assume importance, and that you're not necessarily going back to the socialist era of command by saying that is a direction for emphasis. So I don't think that runs counter to what market economics would prescribe. So to your question, Soumya, why is contractual employment becoming so important? Yes, of course, it has arisen because of the desire to evade labor laws and so on. You get a person on your permanent payroll. Even if labor laws become flexible and you can lay them off, the process will certainly be more complicated than if you have a contractual employee who can be fired. But I regret to say that from what I have observed, and this is totally anecdotal, in the university world with which I am familiar, the constant shift in contracts made by universities with people to run their canteens, student canteens, and so on. Every year there is a change in contractor, and there is just a one-word explanation for this. It is corruption, because when a new contractor is appointed, he pays something under the table in order to get that contract. And very often, the same cooks who worked for the previous contractor work for the new contractor. So they have a lot more job stability than appears to be the case at face value because of the change in contractor. So it's a very, very complicated picture that we have of contractors being changed, but very often the employees of the contractor remaining constant because the students like the food that was being cooked by the cooks in the canteen who was working for the previous contractor. So what do we do in this situation? Labor law reform is obviously a long way off. It's politically challenged and so on. I think the important thing to do is to ensure that the rights of these workers are protected. And a very, very important thing, which I'm again happy to say is in the process of being corrected, is the portability of EPFO accounts, the Employees Provident Fund accounts. We are very fortunate now to have an excellent Provident Fund Commissioner who has finally done the job of making these accounts portable. What used to happen was in the old days when the contractor shifted, even when the employee started working for the new contractor, they would be given a new EPFO number. And this was really a terrible crime because their old contributions got locked up in the old EPFO account, which they could never open up. And so at the moment, the EPFO is sitting on some incredible sum like 8,000 crores or something of money in dead accounts. These are monies which have been contributed over the years by dishwashers and sweepers and all kinds of very, very poor people who could not access their own savings because they had to switch to another contractor. The old account died and they couldn't activate the old account. So those were really terrible episodes in our economic history. And I'm happy to say that that is being changed. But the short answer, why is there a preference for contractual employment? I think there is a one-word answer to that, and that is corruption.
Okay. No, that's very interesting. Niranjan, if I have to come to you, I think, again, there is some data which I'd like to show, a quote, is that if you just look into the employment generation program of the Prime Minister, which is, there has actually declined by 24.4% from 4,28,000 jobs in FY13 to around 3,23,000 in FY16. In FY17, till October 16, when the latest data is available, is that it has only created around 1,90,000 jobs. So why this is happening? What are the limitations for government in creating enough jobs? And we have been listening this for a long time, that job creation in the employment, if you look at the government sector, there is a freeze, or sometimes, there are other issues which I will come into in later details. But what are the, is there any way of rectifying this? Because, if I just look into the government employment data, I think the numbers always show a declining trend.
See, I agree with Jahangir that employment data is a little complicated, and I wouldn't put too, because whether it is the NSSO data, whether it's the Labor Bureau data, there are too many issues with that data. So whether employment has fallen actually, or employment growth, I would still remain skeptical about it, I think that actually I wanted to, just go back to a bit of what Jahangir was saying about industrial policy. Now, I think that there are 2 or 3 ways of looking at how to create jobs. I don't think the government can explicitly create jobs, but how do you create, how do you think through this process? And I think there are like 3 ways to do it, right? One is, you would say that these are certain sectors in the economy which tend to be more labor intensive. So you have textiles, garments, construction, logistics perhaps now with GST, etc. So these are the employment intensive industries, and you see what are the constraints on these industries, can we ease them a bit, So I'm not saying, again, industrial policy in the sense of, giving them subsidies or anything, because in a dynamic world, you don't know, with technological change, some of these jobs may just be automated away. But so look at, there is data on, which are the more labor intensive industries where India can focus. The second way to look at it is perhaps the types of enterprises which create jobs. So again, in the pre-91 era, it was assumed, even in the second plan, that the capital intensity of Indian industry would increase, but there would be village industries and small industries which would absorb labor, you know. So it was a sort of a two-stage this process. Now that is not possible, but perhaps it is very clear globally that SMEs are the main driving force of employment generation. And the third way to look at it is this between tradables and non-tradables. You know, so if you think about what the Chinese did, the Chinese actually, put the tradable sector of the economy at a premium over the non-tradable sector, and they did it through managing the exchange rate. Now, it's not possible that we always do this, but I think that very often, instead of industrial policy, what sometimes the country needs is exchange rate policy, you see, to ensure that your exchange rate is not overvalued. So I think that is the thing. So the labor data per se, I continue to be a skeptic. I continue to believe that job creation has happened. It's of low quality jobs perhaps, but it has happened. The NSSO and Labor Bureau data has too many problems. But I think we can still continue without going all the way to an industrial policy. We can continue to think strategically about job creation.
Yeah. But even if that is true, that means, if you have to agree to, agree with all of you points on a common platform, is that the quality of jobs has not been that great. So,
I have a problem with the use of the term quality of jobs. Who am I to decide whether this job is of a better quality than that? And I'm guessing by which we mean manufacturing jobs are better quality than becoming a barber in a salon. Who am I to decide that? We need jobs to be created. Why are we insisting that we only want higher quality jobs? Again, that's my problem. My problem is that we need to get away from this idea that some jobs I decide is of high quality and of low quality, and therefore I will only go for quote-unquote high-quality jobs. My industrial policies will be for high-quality jobs. Why? A job is a job.
If I have to rephrase that...
Why, I'll tell you, because by low quality, high quality, one means high productivity and low productivity jobs. There is in history, there has never been a country which has progressed or abolished mass poverty without people moving from low productivity to high productivity. I think that's understood, right? So
no, I understand that. But then we need to talk about, we all want high productivity. We want also anyone who's even doing service sector job to be high productive, right? So my only point is that when we talk about these things, it gets trapped into this idea that we want people to be working in an automobile factory is a good job, and working somewhere else is a bad job. And the example that I'll have, and I'll just take 2 minutes, if you ever go to Bandra, just behind Leelavati Hospital, there's this cafe called Saltwater Cafe. And opposite that, there is a haircutting place called Jean-Paul Begin. It's an FDI, foreign direct investment. We don't talk about it as in foreign direct investment. At any given point in time, you'll see at least 10 men and about 20 women working there. These are 25,000, 30,000 rupees jobs. The lady who runs it, Carol something, I forget her name, has now opened a school where she is teaching how people for grooming industry. So this is an FDI, which is about $100,000 that came into India about 7, 8 years ago. It hires about 40, 50 young people every month and has now, quote unquote, transferring technology through schools, by opening a grooming school. If you go for any manufacturing job, you probably require a few $1 million to create one manufacturing job. And that's the difference, that we are, and this is a single brand retail and all of that stuff. So my point is that we do not go around to foreign countries and we say, look, we really want you to come and open up these kinds of jobs, even though they are they create more employment, they are far more labor intensive. We still go for whatever the high-tech manufacturing jobs, which require millions and millions of dollars to create just one job. That's the point I was trying to make.
Okay. Mr. Srivastava, in this context, I think you already mentioned, we had a discussion on the MSME sector. And I think as we have been discussing throughout the day, that to create employment in the MSME sector, government has recently implemented the MUDRA scheme. It has been implemented last year, and as of now, I think around 7.5 crores, if I am not correct, if I am correct, that around 8 crores of MUDRA loans have been sanctioned so far. So there is an argument, I mean, which goes around that even if basically this has gone to 8 crore units. So the argument is that even if these 8 crore units say employ, even if one people, or say one of the people has used this loan to set up an artisan shop or anything else, so that in itself has created around, say, 8 crores of new entrepreneurs in the country. So do you think it's a better way to look into these data rather than looking into the NSSO data of job creation?
I think as Jahangir said, there is no data on employment. So under MUDRA also, so far, we have not been capturing employment data. This year we are making an attempt to capture the employment data. We are creating a module shortly. But for last 2 years, we don't have a data on employment. Mainly because the focus of the program itself is funding the unfunded, making funds available to those who are unfunded by the banking community or other channels. So in the first 2 years, the focus was making funds available and increase the supply to this particular sector. And as you see the targets for MUDRA, thanks to the entire banking community, the targets for last 2 years are broadly achieved. The figure you mentioned, 7.5 crore, is not actually number of units. It's number of accounts. Now, there are a lot of possibilities in analyzing this data. One is there may be overlap between one bank and the other bank. Same entrepreneur may have taken loans from different banks within the MUDRA's eligibility norms. Secondly, within the same bank also, the entrepreneur may have taken 2 loans in 2 different years. So over the year also the overlap could be there. So we don't know how many number of units are there as such, but when we classify the data in terms of existing units, existing accounts and new accounts are roughly 30% of the overall data. So 2.25 crore new accounts are there. But as I said, we don't know out of this 2.25 crore. There may be yearly overlap, there may be overlap between banks. So how many number of units are there that we don't know?
2.25 out of 7.5.
Yeah. So roughly 30%. I think I have the figures. So that is one thing. And as Jahangir said earlier, one is if these many units are being funded and annual targets under MUDRA is being increased substantially, I think 32% increase was there in the second year overall. So I guess that reasonable number of jobs have been created by the new accounts added under the MUDRA. And one is the job creation and another is the composition of the jobs. As Jahangir rightly pointed out, women, 73% of the accounts are owned by women and 57% to the underprivileged sections of the society and 13% for the minority. So the kind of people who are being touched by MUDRA across the country, mostly in the rural areas, that is also a substantial story. And another thing is among the new units itself, the growth, you may be knowing there are 3 sub-schemes under MUDRA, Shishu, Kishore and Tarun. Shishu is below 50,000 loan requirement, Kishore up to 5 lakh and Tarun up to 10 lakh. So the trend between the 2 years is that in the second year, the growth is more in the higher segment, Kishore and Tarun. So that shows that reasonable size of units being funded under MUDRA, not the very small one, under the new units.
So is this an exercise which you are doing to find out how much jobs, potential jobs could be created out of these 2.24 crore units? Yes, we are making it. Okay, so I think that would be a good exercise. Now that we have extensively debated on the trends in the employment, I would like to ask the audience about their views. I mean, if you have any questions at this point of time, if you can.
Sri from Citibank. Very interesting discussion. Thank you for this. You know, I guess everybody in the panel agrees that measuring jobs is most important. What I would like to hear from you is what's holding us back. We've talked about the urgency required in measuring jobs. But at the end of the day, we have been, as a country, producing data like IIP, CPI, WPI, with all their imperfections, let's say, but for over the years, which gives us some kind of trend. So what I'm interested in knowing is, in your opinions, what's really holding us back from getting a monthly employment data with whatever imperfections there are? Thank you.
The big difference is that when you're talking about production data or price data, you just need a few quotations from markets. I mean, there is a single point at which your data can be collected. Whereas if you're looking for employment data, you actually have to survey households. And there are very many more households than price points or production points. So it's basically a question of covering this very large number of households or conducting an employment survey every year. Now, you know, I have studied the NSS employment surveys quite closely. I don't know why we haven't had any results after 2009-10. At least they have not been made public. And I have, in recent years, I regret to say I haven't been tracking it closely enough to know whether a survey was conducted and it was not tabulated, or if an employment survey was not conducted at all. One of the problems in data collection in our country is, you know, Jahangir was referring to the absence of a statistics law. I think what people are not aware of is how strapped the Central Statistical Organization and the NSSO are in terms of manpower. Their survey manpower has not grown. And the burdens upon them have greatly increased. So, for instance, we now have quarterly national accounts data, and then we had a shift in database, so then they had to do a new survey. Remember the new GDP series, which had a lot of problems. So they've had to do so many things with the same manpower that they have really suffered acutely in being able to adhere to their old work pattern, you know, of employment surveys every 5 years. So I think the statistics data, in terms of the internal fiscal allocation within government, has been treated as something of a stepchild. It just hasn't been able to get the funding it needs in order to deliver good data. So that is another reason. But so all these reasons add up. Yeah.
It's glad that we are at least on a common platform that the adequacy of job data in India is grossly inadequate. Any other question?
Yeah, hi, my name is Nirbhay and I am from SBI CAPS. My question is to Jahangir. Two things which Jahangir mentioned was the quality of jobs and perhaps the policy intervention in creating fresh jobs. Don't you think that quality of jobs is essential? If it comes with no stability, it doesn't create any future entrepreneurial risks in people, and also it doesn't increase the saving propensity and the investment future on. And second question is, there is a widening gap between self-employment and employed in the formal sector. Amit Shah had said that a lot of employment is coming in the self-employment space. But if you see Germany, Norway, they had realized this gap far ahead, and they linked to basically the development of education in human capital with industry demand. And that's how they progressed. So unless and until a policy intervention happens from the government, it may not be so possible to just keep on saying that the jobs will be created through self-employment. Thank you.
So let me take your second answer first. I think you're absolutely right. And if you look at the kind, in the Prime Minister's visit to Germany, one of the biggest MOU that was signed, which no one mentioned about it, was precisely this, that the Skills Development Corporation and the Ministry of Human Resource and Development would now adopt the German model of providing skills, which is very different from the model which currently available over here. And I'm talking about vocational training, where you take a person after grade 12, after you know, grade 10 or grade 12, and put them into 6 months training into whatever auto mechanics or whatever, lathe machines, etc., Rather, you put them into 2 months courses in these institutions and put them for next 2 months as as hands-on training in a unit, and you bring them back again 2 months, 4 months later into, again, training them and train them over a period of time. And I think that they're moving towards it. The point I was trying to make is that government should make those kinds of investments. What government should not decide is whether or not this job is better and therefore I'm going to put money into it and funding into it and policy support over here, and that job is bad. Because governments almost always get it wrong. So that was my point. But it is the duty of the government, and we didn't talk about that the skill development is a critical element. And more than job creation, and I think Soumya wanted to say that, didn't want to say it when he talked about for one job he gets lakhs and lakhs of applications, but most of these applicants don't make it even to the first cut because of the quality of the education system. That is clearly a government's responsibility, and they need to do that. So that's the, sort of my response to your second question. To your first question, I think, look, it's hard to give a straight answer to your question whether one thing is right or the other. So, at the end of the day, we are making policy choices, and we make policy choices based on limited information. As a policymaker, I don't have micro-level data, or even the micro-level data is probably going to confuse me or create more complications. So as policymakers, we need to step aside and sort of make calls on data that is, best reflecting, or the most parsimoniously reflects reality. I know it's not an answer to your question, but that's sort of the point I was trying to make.
My next question is that we have talked about that the lack of job creation in last 1 or 2 decades, but possibly we have entered into the age of automation. So driverless car, 3D printing, all that. Then what is the future of this since the emerging...
We'll come to that. We'll come to that in a short while.
Second point is that what Jahangir has rightly mentioned, that the lack of availability of the job data. And there's been a talk that possibly the central bank will move towards the model-based policy rate. Then lack of availability of the job data from the periodic and the quality perspective. What is the future of that model-based policy rate decision? Thanks.
You answered your question. Yes, there is. As I said, I have enormous sympathy for the Monetary Policy Committee and the deputy governors who have to literally make policy calls essentially blind. Forget about job data. They don't even know whether this economy is on an upswing or a downswing. There's a basic data that a central banker needs to have is the cycle going up or are we on a down cycle? They don't even know that. So, I have enormous sympathy for that. And yeah, in the absence of proper data on employment, those things are again going to be policies that we make in very approximate sense.
I will quickly, let's take the audience reaction. Let's have a poll now in terms of, if you can put up the question 2 on the, so let's see what the audience feels, which are the sectors which will provide employment, whether it's manufacturing, construction, trade and transport, or IT, BPO. So which sectors will create more jobs in India over the next decade or so? Okay, so that's very interesting answer. In fact, I was about to come to this point, and so basically everybody is talking about a boom in the construction sector maybe in the next 4 to 5 years. Let me just straight away put these questions to Dr. Rajaraman. I think it's a very interesting observation I'll put in front of you. one of the issues which have been discussed, and I think this question has two parts. The first part is basically the job creation era of digitization and automation. So whether the industry needs the flexibility to reduce workforce in the case of a downturn. So that's point number one, because there has been talks in yesterday that the World Economic Forum, that the fourth industrial revolution could actually happen, and this could affect millions of jobs in the next 5 to 10 years. The other point which I would like to mention is that I would like to give you a very quickly a changing nature of the job structure in India. In 1980s, when jobs were created in India, that were mostly in sectors like community, personal and social service, public administration, education, and research. In 1990s, 60% of the jobs were created in the trade, hotels, and transport sector. Then came 2000, the boom real estate. The construction sector constituted 38% of the total jobs. Now, after that, the construction sector job creation has significantly dwindled. So do you believe that it is difficult to also, because these two questions are related. So given this fact that the service sector in India has been very volatile, for example, sometimes it has been community sector, sometimes trade sector, sometimes construction sector. So is it a little bit difficult to rely on the service sector, and that's the problem of, and whether this digitization and this job growth in the service sector is somehow related? Because whenever we see this job growth in the service sector, that has been volatile, and it may be very difficult to find out whether this is an adequate way of creating jobs which are stable in nature.
Well, your first question had to do with whether we should move to flexible labor laws. Was that your question?
Yes.
I think there can be no two opinions on that. We do need flexibility in labor laws so that the labor force can be expanded or contracted in accordance with demand. That is important as a part of the incentive structure for any potential investment in any sector, not just manufacturing. But what we have in India at the moment, we do have de facto flexibility because of this whole contract business. It's sort of the under-the-line kind of, under-the-table kind of flexibility. And the workers are the ones who suffer as a result of this because they have absolutely no worker protection. In fact, the situation is so very bad that at the moment, when let's say a Maruti factory, hires, so let's say 100 laborers a day through a contractor, the service tax is passed on by the contractor to the employees, actually. They are the ones who pay the service tax. It's totally criminal what happens. And on a Maruti assembly line, you'll have working side by side a permanent worker who has all the benefits, and this contractual worker who has none of the benefits, and on top of everything is paying service tax for this privilege of working at half the wage of the permanent laborer. So you have appalling things going on in formal industry in this country, and that can only be corrected when you have both flexibility in hiring and better labor regulation so that there is justice in the workplace, justice on the shop floor, and worker protection. And you can't have that unless you have the legal structure fully in place. So that is an answer to your first question. Your second question was?
That is the changing nature of the service sector in India has been very volatile in terms of job creation.
I think it is a little misleading sometimes to look at a decadal pattern of generation of employment. I think what he's trying to tell you is that time's up. It's misleading to look at this decadal pattern. What you need to look at is employment elasticities, which survive differences in decadal percentages of job creation, because in one decade there might have been more demand for the output of a particular sector, but the employment elasticities are likely to have been quite stable across the sectors. So I actually commend the judgment of the audience. They have selected the construction sector, in fact, in which the employment elasticity has traditionally been high and stable. And I think the prospects are good on that front. I hope I've answered your question.
Okay, no, that's fine. I think the last thing, and I think there was already questions on this from the audience. I would like, see in terms of there are a couple of issues regarding the quality of education, female participation, and global practices. I think Jahangir, you raised this point earlier also. One of the point is that if you look into China, I mean, the diversification of the employment structure has been much quicker in China. For example, in 1978, both China and India had 71% of their workforce employed in agriculture. However, in the due course, India had fallen considerably behind China with respect to the proportion of non-agricultural workers. So is there anything we can learn from China? Because I was looking into some data, and which shows that China indeed had created a lot of jobs in the countryside.
No, I'll agree completely with both Dr. Rajaraman and Niranjan. Both of them spoke about that. If it is perfectly okay to think about, I'm going to transfer 60% of my population away from the villages and into the cities. In reality, it is a very, very difficult task, unless you have, as Niranjan is pointing out, and you also pointed out, you have somebody helping you out, which happened to be globalization. You basically produce frisbee factories, plastic frisbee factories, or whatever, things, and people were buying it. No one buys those things anymore. And consequently, it is very difficult to continue producing that. So what China has been doing is that it is not creating urbanization the manner in which we think about urbanization, which is city centers around manufacturing zones. They have started to push their their urbanization deeper and deeper into the countryside. So what is country and what is rural economy? And that's, I'm guessing, what Dr. Rajaraman was pointing out in terms of food processing and things like that. Those have become, it is no longer the case that people, which was to be the old thing, where people would travel from far provinces from China and come to Shanghai and work in these factories, etc. They have pushed their workplaces towards rural economy, and this rural-urban divide in terms of urban planning doesn't exist anymore. They have become much more flexible. And we will be forced into doing that. So, and you can see that happening, when you go to Maharashtra or Bengal or anything of that sort. You are getting that thing happening. So look, that is going to happen. And I think it's the pace of change that we are more worried about. China managed to do it in 20 years. We haven't managed to do that. And I think that's where all the industrial policies and things that Niranjan keeps talking about, undervalued exchange rate, played a role. My point is that that was a world in which it could have made a difference. We have gone past that world. We need to face up to the reality that globalization isn't going to give us the 2-3 percentage points of growth the way it did in the past. I was just going to end up with just one last thing, just to make a point that Dr. Rajaraman said about two people working in a Maruti factory, one who is a casual worker and one who is a permanent worker, and their rights are different. But worse, and this is tying up to the question that was asked how difficult it is to get labor statistics. By the way, the person who is working as a permanent worker is a manufacturing worker under labor law, and the person who's working as a casual worker is a service provider, is a logistic provider. So if you actually use that, then the same guy doing exactly the same work in the assembly line, one of them will become a service sector employed, and the other person is going to become a manufactured person employed in the manufactured sector.
Okay, thank you, Jahangir. I have last two quick questions. One for Niranjan and one for Dr. Rajaraman. I think this also, because of lack of time, we'll just touch on it. I think one of the issues in India's education, in the job creation, is the employment, education, and training. If you look into the OECD data, 31% of the youth aged 15 to 29 in India are not in employment, education, and training. This is more than the OECD average and almost 3 times of China. Is it because that there are not enough quality jobs being created in the system, or that there are high constraints in the education and training systems, or because of the fact that these people are actually not trained enough? And this is primarily the point which we have been discussing throughout the question, is whether we are creating adequately paying jobs. So is there any remedy for that? Whether skill development will only do, or any other thing you would like to highlight?
Soumya, actually, when the OECD had first published this number, I think in February or March,
Yes.
and I was struck by it, that 30% of people in 15 to 29 are neither in education, employment, or training. But actually, when you think through it, one reason this number could be very high is the low female participation rate
Yes.
in India. That in India, it's like ridiculous. Someone 27, 28%, and in China it's 60%, Indonesia 50%. So I think actually what this shows is that there is a large amount of women who are not. It's not so
Yes.
much training or jobs. It's just that means both from the social point as well as from the economic point. I think it's a scandal that so much human talent is wasted because of our social structure. So I think this number is inflated because of extremely low female participation in the labor force and also high dropouts of girls. So therefore, if you're not in education or employment or training, you're by definition at home. So that's, I think, what it shows.
Okay. No, I think that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, so just 1 minute. So I actually had written to somebody in the OECD to ask whether this theory of mine is right. And so they have broken it up by gender, they said. So the EET or whatever, for males is 15%, and for females it's 57% in India. That just shows the... So I think it's a gender issue more than an economic issue here.
No, I think that's a very interesting point, and that actually brings us direct to the last question, Dr. Rajaraman. And if I look into the data again, and this is the question which Niranjan just said, 65% of the Indian women with college degrees are not working today. Bangladesh, it is 41%. In Indonesia, Brazil, it is only 25%. So is there, any way we can actually remedy this problem? Because the gains to which this female participation in the labor force could actually happen is tremendous. Some numbers float around. For example, G20 has given that GDP could actually go up by 6 trillion and the tax revenue could go up by 1.5 trillion if we are able to make a proper balance between the women and the men gender participation in the labor force.
Is this working? Yeah, okay. This issue has been referred to in previous sessions, and Chairperson Arundhati Bhattacharya also referred to it in one of the sessions. Very quickly, I think the big decline in labor force participation among women happened between 2004-05 and 2009-10, when it declined from the approximate region of 33% to 28%. And at that point, there was a lot of criticism of the 2009-10 data, the 66th round, and we were told there were a lot of errors in it. We have to wait for the next survey for this to be corrected, and then that never happened. So we don't know what has happened after that. But I do believe that there has been a decline in labor force participation among women. In part, though not entirely, this reflects the shift of population from rural to urban areas, because traditionally labor force participation among urban women has always been much lower than among rural women, in part, but not entirely. So I think the big problems, and these were referred to by your chairperson correctly, is the huge lack of certified child care and the huge lack of certified geriatric care. So within the Indian household, as it is traditionally structured socially, the woman of the household is the default care provider for all children, old people, people who've fallen ill, and so on. And when she's carrying that kind of a burden, she herself might have a preference not to commit herself to a regular job because of the stress that would impose on her. What is the way out of this? Well, I have been writing and propagating the great need for having certification courses for childcare, for geriatric care. This is extremely important because it's not as though childcare is not available. It's just that it's terribly unreliable and varies a great deal in quality. And these women who come forward to take care of children are not in the least trained in anything remotely approaching, child psychology or cleanliness or even basic hygiene. So if we were to do that, we would get, two birds with one stone, because on the one hand, you would be releasing a woman, a talented, skilled woman, to work in the labor force. And at the same time, you would be providing work to another woman who would be stepping forward with the certification, which has skilled her and turned her into a very certified, reliable, professional provider of care for children. I think if you were to do this, we would proceed towards raising the labor force participation of women.
Okay. Thank you, the panelists. It was a great discussion. So hopefully, I mean, the Indian, as I understand, is that the jobs are being created, but may not be adequate in number, and possibly the compensation is not adequate. So that should always be an issue in any jobs. Thank you, all of you, for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much for that. Ms. Bhattacharya, may I please invite you on stage to give away a token of appreciation to our panelists. Hi, thank you so much. Well, after 2 days of intense deliberations and stimulating discussions on the most relevant issues of our times, it's now time to wind down on the 4th edition of the SBI Banking and Economics Conclave 2017. I hope the ideas and debates will stay with you for a very long time. I know for me, it's been a thoroughly enriching experience. May I finally call upon Mr. P.K. Gupta, Managing Director, Compliance and Risk at State Bank of India, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Chairman, ma'am, distinguished guests, members of the electronics and print media, my colleagues from SBI, other SBI group companies, ladies and gentlemen. A very good evening to all of you. It's my privilege to propose a vote of thanks and bring this conclave to a close. In fact, I did this job last year also, so this is the second year running I'm doing this vote of thanks. The conclave started yesterday with an address by Mr. Paul Krugman. Subsequently, Honorable Finance Minister Mr. Arun Jaitley addressed us through the VC from Delhi. He talked about the various initiatives or the various steps that the government has taken, including about the smooth implementation of GST. Subsequently, we had interaction with the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, as well as the Minister of State for Commerce, the Union Cabinet. I think Mr. Sriram had summed up the discussions yesterday very well, so I will not go into that. Today we started the day with an address by Mr. A.S. Kiran Kumar, Chairman ISRO. He informed us in detail about the various path-breaking and at the same time low-cost innovations that the ISRO has been making. ISRO has made all of us very proud with their achievements. But I think what was more interesting about his address was that how the space technology is being used by ISRO for the benefit of the common man. So thank you, Mr. Kiran Kumar, for sparing time coming here today and addressing all of us. After that, we had the CEO panel discussion, I think, which was the most interesting and the informative discussion that we had today. They discussed everything from leadership to digital to how to bring more women into the workforce. Zia Modi talked about the people prefer intelligent women to stupid men. Mr. Amitabh Kant, of course, said that if you want to promote entrepreneurship, we have to learn to live with the failures also. Baba Ramdev, of course, in his inimitable style, gave us a lot of tips, very practical tips at that, for business, for leadership, and he also demonstrated some of the tips by doing the yoga demonstration also. I think there are a lot of learnings which came out of that particular session. After that, we had that GST panel discussion. I think still there are a lot of doubts on what the GST exactly is. I think the panel did clear some of the doubts. I guess most of you would have been getting a lot of the GST jokes on your WhatsApp messages. I think 2 of them I got today. One was that somebody goes to a restaurant and the waiter asks whether you want clear soup or the GST soup. He says, what is a GST soup? He says, not clear soup. The second joke, of course, I got was that the bride's father is talking to the groom and asking, what exactly do you do? So he says, I run my own business. So he says, in that case, you would know all about the GST. He says, boss, शादी करनी है तो करो क्यों ऐसे उठ-पुट सवाल पूछते हो? Anyway, so I think that session did bring some clarity about what the GST is all about. But I don't think that that discussion would have been enough to clear all the doubts. As the time goes by, I think the more clarity will emerge. But the session did help clear some of the doubts that we all of us had actually. After that, Mr. Rajesh Agarwal, Minister of Finance from the UP, we had discussion with him. He talked about the various steps that the government of UP is taking to improve not only the law and order situation in the state of UP, but also to improve the business climate so that more investment can happen and the UP can get onto a higher growth path. Subsequent to that, we had the panel discussion, which was moderated by Mr. Shriram, and talked about the declining trade and rising protectionism. Panel did agree that the protectionism is growing, but at the same time, I think most of the panel members were very sanguine that at least as far as South Asia and particularly India is concerned, that we will continue to see growth in our trade volumes. And not only that, the India will continue to be a preferred destination for the investments. Of course, during the course of the discussion, David did make a proposal to Shobna. So I think if the deal gets through, I think we should get the credit for that actually. And I was particularly more interested because of my role as a Managing Director, Compliance and Risk, when Shobna talked about the various risks that the businesses are facing. She talked about the cybersecurity risk, climate change risk, product recall risk, apart from the geopolitical risk, which the panel also talked about. The last panel, of course, was the economist panel. I think Conclave, a lot of things keep changing. And one thing which doesn't change is the last panel discussion on economics. So, and as usual, they had their share of disagreements, but I think this time, the economists agreed more. There was more disagreements amongst the audience. The audience was virtually divided down the middle when you said 50-50, whether it's a jobless growth or the jobs have been created in the last few years or not. The panel did talk about the MSME creating more jobs. They talked about the MUDRA creating some jobs also. And of course, the panel agreed that the demographic dividend is an asset, not a liability, which of course contradicted what Mr. Paul Krugman was talking yesterday to some extent. But lack of data on employment, I think that was the biggest probably concern which the panel highlighted. So now to the vote of thanks. I, on behalf of State Bank of India, the group companies, and on my personal behalf, would like to extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all the speakers for gracing this occasion with their presence and sharing their valuable opinions. I'm also grateful to all the panelists who took time out from their busy schedules and made the panel discussions very informative and lively with their inputs. This annual conclave is the brainchild of our chairman, Mrs. Bhattacharya, and she has been the driving force behind these conclaves. Without her active support, guidance, and hand-holding, this event would not have been possible at all. So a huge round of applause to her, please. An event of this magnitude requires huge amount of planning and execution skills. We have been very fortunate that within SBI, we have a team of people which is very dedicated and motivated. Of course, they have gained some experience over the last 4 years also. The team has been led by a CFO, Anshula Kant, and Soumya Ghosh. Both of them have worked very hard to see that this conclave gets through without any problems. I would also like to place on thanks the contribution made by the entire organizing team, comprising of the staff from our Economic Research Department, Marketing Department, Chairman Secretariat, and the Liaison Department. The entire organizing team worked tirelessly over the last few days and ensured the flawless execution of all the plans that we had made. Above all, I'm grateful to all the audience, all our guests who are present here today, or were present yesterday also, who took time out of their busy schedules and graced this occasion. I'm also thankful to the media for their presence and the coverage, some of which has already been done. I hope that some will happen tomorrow also. Special thanks to CNBC TV 18 and Sumera Abdi for comparing this program also. And finally, while I say thanks to you, I bid goodbye and hope to see you again at the 5th edition of this conclave next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that. And with that, we'll wrap up then. And we hope to see you all next year. Please do join us for high tea.